Hey guys, welcome to the lecture series of the dairy management, dairy, cattle and buffalo management lecture series. So this is your first lecture, overview of the livestock sector of Sri Lanka and the role of the veterinarian in Sri Lanka's socio-economic development, current status and future goals. Now before you listen to this lecture, I want you to please go through the pre-test questions that I have given, if I remember right. I have given about 30 questions based on this lecture. Now, please spend 5 to 10 minutes to think about those, right? Yeah, I understand you don't know the questions, you haven't studied it, right? But just think about it. You know, it's a term we use to describe such thinking. We call it brainstorming, right? So scientifically, it has been shown that when you brainstorm, right, your long-term memory, your comprehension, all that develops, all that improves, right, before you listen to the lecture, if you do that, right? So while you listen to the lecture, so you're answering the pre-test questions is step one, and step two is listening to the lecture. And so when you do that, your comprehension will be much better if you had gone through the questions beforehand, right? So spend 10 minutes to go through those questions, and that will be wise investment of your time, right? So don't be lazy. Take a notepad or an exercise book, try to answer those questions to the best of your knowledge. I know you cannot do any group work if you are at home, right? But if you can do some group work with roommates, right, that would be wonderful. Maybe you have a sister or brother who goes to school. Discuss with him or her if you are at home, right? And it's bound to benefit you. I can guarantee you that. Right. So when you see a long title or whatever like this, you should try to understand what the keywords are on this title. Right? Can you understand the keywords? Can you think of the keywords here? I'll give you 10 seconds to think of the keywords. Right? So to me, the keywords are livestock sector, the role of the veterinarian, socio-economic development, right? Now, see, this is important. Sometimes you get long essay questions, for example, right? Not just dairy management, might be anatomy, pathology, medicine, surgery, right? So when you get a question, essay question especially, or even a structured question, you need to be able to identify the keywords, right? Because now, say if this is a question and you only answered about the livestock sector and the role of the veterinarian, without giving emphasis on the socio-economic development, you are not going to get full marks, right? So it's important to dissect a phrase, long phrase like this, and to understand the keywords first and foremost, right? Right. Okay, so we say overview of the livestock sector. The first question is, what do you understand by livestock, right? So now, I will go relatively fast on these lecture videos, right? Because you can pause the video whenever you want, right? If you didn't understand anything in the lecture room, of course, I'll go through those twice or thrice. But on these videos, I'm planning on going through relatively fast because then the file size will be smaller for you to download and all that, right? So if you didn't understand anything, you could always pause it, rewind it, listen again, and so forth, right? So I hope you have already answered this question by going through the pre-test, what you thought livestock was, right? Now the thing is, a lot of things depend on the book you read, right? Depends on the author that define. Now certain things, the American way of definition and the British definition are different. So these are typical example. So here the Cambridge Dictionary says animals and birds that are kept on a farm, right, is described as livestock. But if you look at Encyclopedia Britannica, it says livestock with the exception of poultry, right? So one says includes birds, the other one says with the exception of poultry, right? So generally, even in Sri Lanka, when we say livestock, we generally don't include poultry into that, right? But then again, I have seen some people do that when they say livestock. Even high-ranking officials I have seen, university staff as well as people from the ministry, the DAPH. I have seen them use the word livestock loosely to include poultry, right? But generally, when we say livestock, poultry is not included, right? So there is no point arguing on these things, saying one party saying poultry is included, the other party saying no, it's not included. No point arguing. The best thing is don't use the term livestock. Right? So use the term like farm animals. When you say farm animals, obviously, regardless of the number of legs or whether they have wings, if they are in a farm, it gets included, right? But then again, one could debate, okay, then what about aquatic animals? Are aquatic animals included in farms, right? So let's not get into that debate, right? So as far as I'm concerned, these are the different types of animals that veterinarians have to deal with. Farm animals, aquatic animals, wild and zoo animals, and of course pet animals. Right. So this is what you have to deal with, and from a socio-economic aspect, economic aspect, right? So these are the animals that come in. Right. So obviously, when you say farm animals, right, dairy farming, right, all that should come into your mind. These are the main ones, and you see. So this, the first one that I showed you is a second one, right? Is a large scale farm, and this particular example is a small scale farm, right? Of a woman farmer, right? So this is obviously a poultry farm. Do you think this is a broiler farm or a layer farm? Right? So think. There are broiler farms, and there are layer farms. The one I showed you earlier was a large scale farm. This one is a small scale farm, right? So on the first example, we can call it, we use a term called intensive farming, and then there is semi-intensive farming, and then there is extensive farming. You can research these three words also, brainstorm a little, and I'll go through them in a future lecture anyway. Right? Intensive farming, semi-intensive farming, extensive farming. And that is obviously a goat farm. Now see how different this is compared to the previous ones, right? So they are located on some kind of wooden planks. We call this slats. Ideally these should be reaper, but these are not reaper, right? So reaper we call it slatted flow, right? So this is not a slatted flow. Ideally it should be a slatted flow, right? But see, what's important is they are not on the soil, right? They are elevated from the ground. I'm just giving you basic stuff right now. We don't have to worry about it. And a buffalo farm, right? So do you think this will go as intensive farming or extensive farming? Right? So think about it. And here's a swine farm, right? Piggery, and of course aquatic farming, aquaculture, right? Dr. Fauci, I think, has already taught you aquaculture. Right. Okay. So remember our title, livestock sector, the veterinarian's role in the socio-economic development, right? So how does the veterinarian contribute to Sri Lanka's socio-economic development, right? So one of the questions in the pre-questions was, what do you think are the populations of cattle, chickens, goats, buffalo, pigs, etc., right? So these are the numbers as of 2018, right? So now, today is the 16th of June 2020, right? In 2 years time also, if I'm lazy, I may not re-record this, right? You might be watching in 2022, and you might still have these numbers, but then it's your responsibility to be updated on the latest figures, right? So I usually take these figures from there's something called the annual report by the DAPH. DAPH, as you already know, the Department of Animal Production and Health, they put out annual report every year, right? So with updated numbers. And there's another document they publish called the Livestock Bulletin Statistics, right? Livestock Bulletin Statistics. So that is also, those are the main two documents that I look at to get these figures, right? So today it's 1.4 million cattle, but if you're looking at this in 2025, it might be a different number, vastly different number, right? So it's your responsibility to be updated on the numbers. Okay, right. So these are, okay. Now the human population in Sri Lanka is like 20 million, and look at the poultry population, it's double that, right? However, remember, because chickens have a short lifespan, at any given time point you won't have all 40 million chickens, right? So this is the annual population, right? So at any given time point, it will be much less. So this has both broilers and layers. Layers live a long time, but broilers have only a 35 to 40 day lifespan, right? So every 35 to 40 days, a new population comes, right? So you won't have 41 million chickens at any given time point. I hope that is understood, right? So with these animals, right, which adds up to about 43 million or whatever, right? The veterinarians are responsible for their health, feeding, breeding, housing, welfare, right, and even profitable production, right? So what you need to understand is that veterinarians cannot be responsible only for health, right? Some people think veterinarians' role is only for health, medicine, surgery, right? So that is wrong, because disease, when it comes to farm animals, is usually a result of poor management, right? So when you say management, that could mean feeding management, housing management, welfare, so on, right? So all these are tied together, they go hand in hand. If you feed poorly, right, and then the animal's health declines. So if the veterinarian is called to treat the health, and the veterinarian cannot prescribe a medicine or give an injection or two and expect the animal to be cured, right? So the veterinarian has to go and identify the root problem, which was in feeding, right? So this is why, and similarly, it might be a problem in housing. Let's say the design of the housing is incorrect, therefore animal will always get injured, right? Sometimes floors can be slippery. If floors are slippery, animals slip, right, which can injure their ligaments, tendons, muscles, joints, etc. Right? So there's no point the veterinarian going and fixing the muscles, giving anti-inflammatories or painkillers or whatever, right? If the housing floor doesn't get fixed, animals will continue to have that problem, right? So for that reason, the veterinarian has to know all of these aspects, right? So he has to be able to address all of these aspects, because they go in hand. And you can't just give an injection and expect everything to be fixed, right? So profitable production also comes like that. So if production needs to be profitable, right? Animal has to be in prime health condition, and for animal to be in prime health condition, all of these need to be in optimal condition: feeding, housing, welfare, etc. So the veterinarian cannot escape from the responsibility of all of these. You can't just say, no, no, I'm a veterinarian, my duty is only uh, medicine and surgery. You cannot say that. Okay, and you can't say that, and you can't let others say that either, because there are some certain other professions who want to you know restrict the veterinarian to health, right? But if we do that, the whole livestock industry is going to collapse for the reason I explained, right? You can't just take care of health without taking care of the other aspects, because they go in hand, right? And remember, there is a fundamental principle in farm animal production: disease is usually a result of failed management or poor management, right? So you can't cure disease without fixing the poor management, right? Therefore, veterinarian has to know everything. Okay, right? So these numbers of cattle, chickens, goats, etc. are distributed in, all these farms, right? So 1.4 million cattle in 330,000 cattle farms, 41 million chickens in 180,000 chicken farms, etc., etc. So all of this adds up to about 600,000 farms, right? 600,000 farms means at least 600,000 farmers, right? Some of them might be part-time, right? So some people have, a cow or two at home, and he's not, full-time reliant on that. He might do a job elsewhere. He might be a mason boss, but he might also have cattle at home, right? So maybe all of these 600,000 farmers are not 100% dependent on their agricultural, their livestock farms, right? However, they are at least partly dependent on their farms, right? And these 600,000 farms are bound to have more than 600,000 employees. At least some of them are large-scale farms, which employ as many as 50, 100, or hundreds of employees, right? Employees can be cleaners, grass cutters, milkers, milk bowser drivers, milk and meat processor, factory workers, and so on. So when you take all of that, right, can we imagine the number of families and lives that are dependent on the livestock sector? So Sri Lanka has not done a comprehensive study on this, but I presume we are talking about millions, right? They're probably talking about millions of lives and families that are dependent on the livestock sector, right? And so this is how vets contribute to Sri Lanka's economy. So if vets neglect the livestock industry and allow the livestock sector to collapse, right? Right? So you don't want that to happen. Right? So that's why it is our duty, it is our responsibility to not only maintain the current livestock industry, but to improve it further, right? Okay. So so we don't need cattle and all these farms if they didn't give the milk, the chicken, meat, eggs, beef, pork, mutton, etc. Right? So Sri Lanka currently produces about 500 million liters of milk, half a billion liters, right? 200 million kilograms of chicken meat, nearly 3 billion eggs a year. So all these are annual figures. All these are annual figures, and so on. Right? So even if you look at the direct value of these, right? So right now, milk sells for sometimes as cheap as 65 rupees, or sometimes as expensive as 110 rupees per liter. Right? So the majority of milk is sold at about 70 rupees, 70 to 80 rupees, whereas some few farms that produce very high quality milk, the milk sells at about 110 rupees, as much as 110 rupees as of June 2020. So so if you multiply 500 million by 80 rupees, it comes to 40 billion. So this is the farm gate price, not the market price. So if I go to Kiev supermarket and buy a liter of milk, the what's it called, the milk in the cartons, right? UHT milk. It's going to cost me 250 rupees, right? So if I do that calculation, that will be a lot higher, right? But even if you take the farm gate price, that's about 35 to 40 billion rupees worth of milk. And chicken, right now in the supermarket, it's like 400 rupees per kilogram, and sometimes it goes up to 500 and beyond, right? So even if you take the wholesale farm gate price as 200 rupees, comes to 40 billion rupees. Eggs, I'm just doing a lazy calculation, 2.85 times 11 rupees, something like 30 billion. Beef, 1000 rupees a kilo, right? And these add up to 140 billion. Now, remember this figure, okay? I will come back to that in the next few slides. Remember, I asked you a question about GDP. What did you think the Sri Lankan GDP was? Did anybody thought it was less than 140 billion? Well, 140 billion is the value of the livestock products alone, right? However, this doesn't encompass the economic impact of all these 600,000 farms and so on, right? Right. So then, remember, I asked you a question about the average consumption of milk per person per annum in Sri Lanka, right? So that and what the term was. Did anybody know the term? The term actually is called per capita consumption, right? Per capita consumption is per head, per person, per annum consumption, or actually availability, right? So the average Sri Lankan consumes about 56 liters. Right? So when you say average Sri Lankan consumes 56 liters, there will be people who consume very little. There might be people who consume 500 liters. The average comes to something like 56 liters per year, which is something like 130 milliliters per day, right? And 133 eggs per year, which means about one egg every 3 days, right? 9 kilograms of chicken per year, right? Uh, and that might come to like 20, 30 grams per day, and so on, right? So this brings us to another very important role of the veterinarian, which is food safety, right? See, because if the animals are diseased, right? If the animals are diseased, that disease agent, right, which might be a pathogen like a bacteria or fungus, or it might be the toxic products of bacteria and pathogens, right, that can go down the food chain into humans, causing zoonotic diseases, right, either directly from the animals or from the meat, eggs, chicken, so on, right? If you all have already done parasitology, right, virology, you may already know some examples of this. If you're third year students, right, if you're first year students, of course, then you may not know this, some of these zoonotic diseases, but you can understand the point, right? So if the animals are sick, right, potentially their products, milk, eggs, meat, can be pathogenic for humans, right? So that's where the veterinarians have a role in food safety. Let's see if this works better. Food safety. Right? So veterinarians have a role in food safety and zoonotic diseases, because some of these diseases can spread to the general public. General public is humans, public. So that's how the term public health comes, right? So veterinarians have a role in public health, which we call veterinary public health, right? Okay, so occupational diseases you may have heard of before, you haven't, look it up, right? So can you think of another way, right? So on the veterinary and allied sectors contribute to Sri Lanka's economy. Now we have talked about animals, right? Taking care of them, veterinarians have a role, and they in fact affect the economy. And then the huge number of farms, huge number of farmers, huge number of employees, their families and lives dependent on this, right? And then the direct value of the livestock products, right? And then this aspect. Can you think of any other aspect? No, these animals have to eat, right? Do you think chickens go on grazing outdoors to find feed? No. There is a massive animal feed industry, right? And they produce as much as 1.2 million metric tons, right? That's 1.2 billion kilograms of feed a year, right? Now, some of you may have not seen all this poultry feed and cattle feed, but I'm sure you have seen malu camel, right? The malu camel that you give to the aquaria, right? Your pet fish at home, the malu camel you buy from the shop, small red and green packet. So those are ornamental fish feed, right? But then that is also produced, in a similar way by mixing different ingredients. Similarly, there is feed produced for all these, uh, 41 million chickens, and some of these cattle, of course, are free grazing in the field, right? In tanks, bunds, and grazing land, so they never get to taste commercial feed, right? But the ones in intensively and semi-intensively managed farms, they are given commercial cattle feed, right? So the whole industry is 1.2 billion kilograms per year. Now, can you imagine what a massive industry it might be? Right? So there are 40 poultry feed manufacturers, 161 feed importers, over 50,000 hectares of maize and soy cultivated purely for feed production, right? So can you imagine how much of an economic impact that has, right? I'm presuming, right? So pretty, I don't know how to give a figure to that, but I'm presuming it's millions, if not billions, right? Probably goes into the billions, right? Okay, so this slide summarizes the veterinarian's role on the socio-economic aspect of Sri Lanka, right? So direct economic impact, right? Direct economic here, but here, social aspect, right? So this is the socio-economic impact of veterinarians on the livestock sector. But in addition to this, of course, you have the pet animal sector, wild animals, and so on. Where veterinarian also impacts the socio-economic aspect. Okay, I hope all this is clear, and you should now so go back to those pre-test questions and correct whatever answers you got wrong. I presume you got a lot of answers wrong, because how can you guess these numbers, right? So it doesn't matter. Like I said, the idea was not to get the correct answer. The idea was for your brain to start thinking about it, right? So that brain activity stimulation, that results in better comprehension and long-term understanding and memory when you're actually listening to the video. Right. So I'm going to take a break here. Right. I have been talking for half an hour. Right. So I'm going to take a break here, stop this video. Okay, welcome back guys for the second part of the video. Right, so I initially talked about earlier I talked about the GDP. I'm sure you know what GDP is. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, right? So in 2014, the gross domestic product of Sri Lanka was 14,000 billion rupees, right? So out of this 14,000, there are these four sectors, right? So actually I'm going to go a little fast, right? Initial video, although I said I'll go slow, fast, I actually went slow. I'm going to go a little fast because you can, pause and rewind and all that. So anyway, four sectors, out of which you can see services is the highest, agriculture is 7%, and animal production produces only 10% out of this 7%, according to the central bank report. So that means out of the whole GDP, national GDP, animal production only produces 0.7%, according to the central bank report, right? But however, do you remember that when we added up the values, right, the values of the products, milk, chicken, meat, eggs, etc., we got 140 billion, right? And 140 billion is already like 1% of this, right? So that 1,400 would be 10%, 140 would be 1%, right? But here it says only 0.7%, right? And I mean, what about the direct and indirect impact, right? What about the impact on these families, 600,000 farms, employability, the families and lives dependent on it? What about the impact of the feed industry? What about the impact created here? So none of this is captured in this 0.7%, right? So in my opinion, right, I'm not an economist, right? However, general knowledge tells me that this figure is not correct. Okay, so you can see my cursor. Right, so basically, general knowledge tells me that this 0.7% is not correct. Okay, so right. So that is something we have to work on. Somebody, from the DAPH, Department of Animal Production Health, they have economists, and that's something they should work on. Right. So the direct and indirect economic boosts that I talked about, right? So the direct boost comes from, farm employees, right? The corn or grass or the pasture growers, right? So feed farmers, feed factories. Remember I told you about the 1.2 billion kilogram per year feed factories, feed storage, right? Technicians, milking technicians working in farms, people who manufacture these milking machines, right? And then, of course, small scale farmers, and then truck drivers, milk processing factory workers, and of course, veterinarians. Right? So this will be like a direct economic impact, right? and 350,000 cattle farmers in Sri Lanka are direct beneficiaries of this, right? Different activities shown here. And then there is also indirect economic boost, right? Now imagine, so this, let's say, this is the farmer's house, right? So his economic goes up because of the dairy farm. He builds a house, and when he builds a house, there will be mason bosses, there will be carpenters coming in to do the roof, the windows, doors, right? So there is indirect employment creation in the mason bus and the carpenters, right? And then let's say this is a massive farm, whatever the farm you might have heard of. And so when this farm was built, similarly, all the workers that was involved in building these farms, right? So just an example. See all the bowsers, concrete workers, right? So then the concrete Tokyo Super or whoever, they get business because they are sending out a lot of concrete into the place, right? And then, so the farmers' children may not have gone to school before that, but now the financial situation has gone up, and now these children can go to school, right? So they will become educated, and eventually when they become adults, they will contribute to the country's economy, right? Or this could be the daughter of this mason boss or the carpenter, right? Who couldn't go to school initially, but now because he has work in building houses and farms, he can send his children to school. And another important thing is that in Sri Lanka, there's a lot of malnutrition and underweight children, too thin, too short, 5 years and below, right? So now these children get to drink milk, right? And because the farmer's economy goes up at home, they get to drink better nutritious food and eat more nutritious food, and their health goes up, and infant malnutrition goes away, and the stunted growth goes away. So all these contribute towards the economic boost of the country eventually, right? So there was one question in the pre-test questions. Does Sri Lanka, per capita consumption, is it higher or low? Remember I told you the per capita consumption in Sri Lanka is something like 56 liters, right? So that will be somewhere around here. India obviously has a higher per capita consumption than Sri Lanka, and even Kenya, right? And look at some of the developed countries, 350 liters, 250 liters, right? Now, I'm not saying that we have to drink as much milk as these developed countries do, right? We don't have to just because somebody else does. After all, milk is not meant for adults. It's the nature gave milk as an infant food, right? However, because we have infant malnutrition, we need to improve it. And another reason why we should improve the dairy industry is not because people have to drink milk, but because of all these economic boosts, right? The direct and economic boost. This kind of workforce, you can't use them for, computer software engineering, can you? No, but you can't teach them hardware engineering or software engineering, but you can teach them how to do dairy farming, right? And it's not a bad thing, right? You get milk, which is a natural food, and on the other hand, we can decrease the importations that we spend billions of rupees for importing milk, and then there is economic boost in the country, right? So taking all these together, there is enough justification for us to develop the milk industry. Now look at the world average. See, even the world average is higher than Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is doing pretty bad. And this is 2009 data, right? And it doesn't get any better, as 2014. The world average increases further, but even as of 2017-18, we are averaging only 56 liters per person per annum, right? The per capita consumption is 110 by 2014, right? So we are consuming half the milk of the average consumption of the world, right? And you have a duty to work towards, making things better, right? So now I talked about the direct and indirect impact on the economy. Right? So I don't have Sri Lankan data, but according to United States data, the US dairy industry is worth $200 billion. The direct economic impact. And look at the indirect economic impact. That's $400 billion, right? And it has approximately 1 million direct jobs, 2 million indirect jobs, 3 million total jobs, right? And it's 3% of the GDP of USA. In Sri Lanka, it was like 0.7%, remember? But what I showed you was it's probably more than that. It's just that it has not been, this indirect economic impact has not been captured, right? So, but this shows is that, there is a lot of potential. Right now in 2018, Sri Lanka imported 54 billion rupees worth of milk, right? So if we say that 54 is this, if we can produce this 54 billion worth of milk in Sri Lanka, that will result in a total economic stimulation of 3 times this 150 billion, right? This is extrapolating the data from the US. Right? So like I said earlier, this is 0.7%, in the US it's 3%. There's really no reason why we cannot take this further up. Right? Okay, and then I want to bring your attention to the food aspect, right? The food aspect, right? So one of the questions was I gave in the pre-test was, do you think the veterinarian's role is limited to the farm, or does it extend beyond, right? So actually we say the veterinarian's role extends beyond the farm, right? So there are two terms people use, say farm to fork. Fork is the garapur on the table, right? So the veterinarian has a responsibility, is responsible for the food hygiene, right? The cleanliness of food, not only during inside the farm, but from the farm all the way to the fork on the table, or they also use the term from stable to table. Stable is like the barns, especially for horses, they say istale, right? So that's the stable, from stable to table, from farm to fork, and they also sometimes use the term from grass to milk, right? So on. Right. So all these 5 aspects. Remember we talked about 8 aspects earlier, right? Animal health, animal welfare, profitable production, veterinary public health, food hygiene, right? All these from farm to fork. And when you talk about feeding, breeding, housing, these are encompassed inside these, right? So breeding is a part of a subdivision of health, and housing management, feeding management, that is included in here, right? So the OIE is the equivalent of the WHO for humans, World Health Organization. So this is called the World Organization for Animal Health, coming under the United Nations. And they say the role of veterinary services traditionally extended from farm to slaughterhouse only, right? However, at present, the role of veterinary services has been extended to include subsequent stages of the farm to fork food chain, right? This is the farm to fork food chain they talk about, right? So I'll describe this shortly. Right. So Remember, I also had a question on when you describe 3 ways by which animals can make humans sick and how vets can contribute to veterinary public health, right? So obviously, one thing is that by consuming unhygienic or unsafe food of animal origin, right? So that's another new term, food of animal origin, right? Not food of plant origin, but food of animal origin, right? So that is obviously by consuming unhygienic food of animal origin. What else? What else do you write? Directly from animals you might have written. You remember any examples, right? Maybe you heard of avian influenza. Maybe you heard of um, swine influenza, right? Now, even latest COVID-19 coronavirus, directly from animals. It started in those markets in China, meat markets, right? Okay, so this is a document I got from the OIE. Right? So this shows from farm to fork the veterinarian's involvement, right? So production at the farm, right? And then, so read all this, surveillance, prevention, control of animal diseases, blah, 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 right? And then healthy animals are transported to the slaughterhouse, right? So here also the veterinarian has a role in something called, inspection before slaughter, after slaughter, right? You will learn those in detail for public health every day, right? And then once they are slaughtered, after slaughter, inspection of the carcass, meat inspection, they will be taken to the processing plant, right? Processing, storage and distribution. And then the veterinarian is responsible for verification of hygiene, cold chain integrity, right? And then finally, after packaging and all that, you go to the supermarket. And again, the veterinarian is responsible for monitoring this, right? And then from supermarket or restaurant, onto your plate or to fork, right? So all the way from farm to fork. Throughout the food chain, veterinarians are responsible for regulations on animal health, animal welfare, traceability, food safety, and safe trade of animal products, right? So that is the role of the veterinarian uh, from farm to fork, right? In all these 5 steps: production, transport, slaughterhouse, processing, supermarket. Right. So that was the unhygienic food, right? And the second one is directly from live animals, right? So the typical example is rabies. We have plenty of rabies in Sri Lanka, right? And then, like I said, then the food animals, avian influenza, coronavirus, swine influenza, right? So, and then there's a third one, right? You may not be aware of, so read all this, pause the video and read all this, right? And that third one is through something called antimicrobial resistance. Right now, if you and I, as veterinarians, if we use antibiotics improperly, right? So improper usage of antibiotics, you learn this term, use of antibiotics in suboptimal doses for subtherapeutic doses for suboptimal periods, right? That's what's called improper use of antibiotics, and using antibiotics that are not authorized to be used in food animals. And so when you use uh, prescription antibiotics to animals, right, without proper regulations, so these animals, they excrete metabolites of antibiotics into the environment, right? So then what that does is, so when the bacteria in the environment get exposed to these antibiotics, they become resistant, right? So if the bacterium is resistant to antibiotic, resistant bacteria infects a human being, and now when human doctors give us antibiotics, the bacterium is resistant, right? So the only reason the bacterium got resistant to the antibiotic is because somebody used antibiotics that are, misused. Somebody misused antibiotics on farm animals, and that led to, antibiotics leaching into the environment or metabolites, right? And then bacteria develop antimicrobial resistance, right? So these are the three ways by which animals can make humans sick, and how veterinarians can come into action to prevent that. Okay, so you need to know that. I also asked you about zoonotic diseases, right? So these are some of those zoonotic diseases, right? And then farm to fork food safety, right? We talked about this, process feed, antemortem and post-mortem inspection at the slaughterhouse, right? Veterinary public health dedicated vet, right? So, recently, in around 2017, 16, 17, the government introduced a new division called the Veterinary Public Health Division, and veterinarians were hired to this division, right? So that basically increased the number of harder questions in the government for veterinarians. So this veterinarian is completely dedicated not for treating animals and looking at farm aspect, but dedicated for public health related tasks, right? Okay, so although this is out of the livestock sector, but because we are talking about the socio-economic impact, I thought we talk about these also. Stray dogs is a massive problem in Sri Lanka. 2.5 million stray dogs estimated. 20 to 30 human fatalities every year. That's a lot from rabies. That costs us 500 million rupees a year because you have to vaccinate dogs, you have to vaccinate people. Right? So sometimes a person may get a dog bite and go to the hospital, and hospital has to give them post-exposure rabies vaccination. Now, the dog that bit the human may not be a rabid dog, but because there is rabies in Sri Lanka, the hospital doctors cannot take a chance, and they will have to give him post-exposure rabies vaccination, which is costly, right? Whereas if there was no rabies in Sri Lanka, the doctors don't have to give post-exposure rabies vaccination. Instead, they will clean the wound. Maybe if they suspect that this will get infected, they might give an antibiotic. They don't have to give expensive anti-rabies vaccination, right? So that's how this 500 billion rupees cost comes into play, right? So the way to eradicate rabies is relatively easy in Sri Lanka, given that we are an island, right? However, it won't be a quick process. It will be a long-term process, right? Maybe we can do it by 2030. Right? So the way to do it is, because you can't catch the whole population at once, right? The whole stray dog population. But the way to do it is practical way. You can vaccinate at least 70% of the population consecutively for 3 years. That can have a significant impact. So if you can do that, keep doing that by 2030. So actually, this is something a rabies expert told me, right? You can eradicate Sri Lanka of rabies, right? So the good news is that human rabies deaths have dramatically come down. See, 1970s, human rabies deaths have been as high as 350 to 400 per year, and by 2015 it has come down to 20 to 30. Right. Another good news is dog vaccinations have gone up dramatically from few thousands back in the 70s to over 1 million vaccinations a year. Right. That is all good news. And then human anti-rabies virus use, that is also declining. That means dog bites are declining, right? So all this is good news. However, there's still a long way to go. Right? So the other aspect of veterinarians' involvement comes with the wildlife veterinary services. Right? It's not massive. We have only about 18 vets employed in the Department of Wildlife Conservation, right? 3 main wildlife um, hospitals and transit homes, etc. At Tadusevana, Udawalawe, Kiritade, and Aptidia, so on. Right? So the wildlife of Sri Lanka attracts a lot of tourists, which is 3 billion rupees worth. Right? That's a lot, right? So that's one reason we need to work on conserving the wildlife. One is because we really want to conserve the animals and the nature, and on the other hand, it's a massive income generator for Sri Lanka, right? So we cannot neglect that. HAC stands for Human Animal Conflict. In addition to the human elephant conflict, there are a few other animals also. Monkey relow is another problem, right? So unfortunately, human deaths resulting from human elephant conflict has not gone down. It has in fact increased over the last decade, right, from about 80 to 100. That is really sad. And not only human deaths, but even elephant deaths is on the rise. See, over the last decade, as many as 300 deaths per year, which we really cannot afford, right? So there are ways and means of controlling this, but it has not been done properly in Sri Lanka yet. So this is another huge responsibility in your hands as future veterinarians. Right, so to summarize, we talked about the main role of the veterinarian: health, welfare, profitable production, public health, food hygiene, and we said, breeding, feeding, housing are also, included within these main categories, right? Animal health, we have to take care of farm animals, companion animals, wild and zoo animals, but that profitable production, for example, milk production, egg production, meat production, we don't do that in companion animals or wildlife, right? Food hygiene, again, it's limited to farm animals, right? So these are the different, tasks of veterinarians in different categories of animals, right? Something you have to know is where are the vets working, right? So are they predominantly in the private sector or are they predominantly in the government sector? Right? So you might think they're mainly working in the private sector as in clinics and hospitals, but that's only about 400 altogether, maybe 500 with private practitioners and those working at companies. That's 500 out of about 1500. Right? So 1000 veterinarians are employed by the government sector mainly. And so quickly, I'm giving you 2 assignments. Right? You don't have to do them now, but you have to bring them when you come to faculty when university commences. You will be given marks which will count towards your final exam. Right, so this assignment 1 about micro livestock breeds, you need to do some homework, and this is about dietary requirements, right? So do that as well and bring it when you come